Lesson 23, Section 2. In this presentation, we'll take a look at the subjunctive of am, I am, and talk about constructions like subordinate clauses and how the subjunctive is used in certain kinds of subordinate clauses. These are the forms of the present subjunctive, which we learned recently. Pau all, pau ace, pau a, a verb like pau all. What we're going to do to get to the present subjunctive of am, I am, is simply drop the stem and be left with all the normal subjunctive endings. And then all we're going to do is add smooth breathings and circumflexes all throughout the conjugation. And that's all there is to it to form the present subjunctive. And again, the subjunctive doesn't have much meaning on its own. We have to interpret it, translate it always in context. And we'll look in just a moment at some of the other contexts in which we will see the subjunctive. A clause is a group of words with a subject and a verb. In English and Greek, we speak of two kinds of clauses. First, we have main clauses, and these are independent, that is, they make sense on their own. They don't need any other supplements to their meaning to make perfect sense. An example is, the trumpet gave the signal. This could stand on its own as a fully complete sentence, or it could be added to something else. But either way, it would make sense on its own because it's a main clause. But we also have subordinate clauses. These are dependent, that is, they do not make sense on their own, unlike main clauses. An example would be, when the enemy was near. So this sentence would be incomplete on its own. It needs something else to complete its meaning. It's a subordinate or dependent clause, not a main clause. We've already seen several other types of subordinate clauses. We've seen conditional clauses. If the enemy is near, for instance, we're waiting for something to complete the thought. Indirect questions like, tell me when the enemy is near. Here we need the tell me to complete the meaning of this indirect question, when the enemy is near. Indirect statements like they say that the enemy is near. This whole phrase there, that the enemy is near, is a clause, subordinate clause of indirect statement. And also relative clauses, the enemy who is near. None of these underlined clauses on its own makes any sense without something else to complete its meaning. They're all types of subordinate clauses. The subjunctive is often found in the following types of subordinate clauses in Greek: purpose clauses, clauses of fearing, indefinite clauses, and conditional clauses. We're going to look at each of these over the course of the next few slides. Let's start with purpose clauses. A purpose clause expresses the purpose for which something is done. In English, we start purpose clauses with phrases like in order and so that. For instance, we left early in order not to be late. This was the purpose for which we left early. We left early so that we might not be late. Might is an instance of the English subjunctive, the subjunctive of the verb may. So in English, too, we actually use the subjunctive with purpose clauses, or can. In Greek, a purpose clause often begins with one of the following conjunctions: hina, hapos, or hos. In addition to their meaning in purpose clauses, these three conjunctions, have other meanings as well, which makes this a little tricky. These are the other meanings they can have. Hina and hapos were seen for the first time, but hos we've seen before. It is often seen, in fact, in indirect speech, where it means something like that, to say hos that. Hate is the alternative that you might see in its place. For this reason, the fact that these words have other meanings in addition to their use in purpose clauses, we must be on the lookout for the second ingredient in a purpose clause, a verb in the subjunctive. So for purpose clause, we need one of these conjunctions, hina, hapos, or hos, and we need a verb in the subjunctive. Let's look at an example. Akuamen ton dikaion hina dikaioi omen. So our first ingredient we listen to the just in order to be just. Akuamen, we listen to or hear. Ton dekaion, the genitive of the adjective being used as a noun here. And we use the genitive with the verb akual when we're talking about whom we are listening to. And we get hina, the conjunction here. And we also get our, we could use hapos or hos, as we saw before, hina, hapos, or hos for the conjunction in a purpose clause. And then our final ingredient is the subjunctive. In this case, the subjunctive of eme, I am. This is the first person plural, the subjunctive of we are, basically. So we have the two ingredients that we need. We have our conjunction, hos, hapos, or hina, and we have our verb in the subjunctive. So we would take this, hos dekaioi omen, this group of three words, as a purpose clause, a subordinate clause. As with most other uses of the subjunctive, purpose clauses are negated with me. For instance, aku amen ton dekaion hina me adekoi omen. So we've changed two things. We've added the me in there. We've also changed dekaioi to adekoi. So we're saying basically something the reverse of what we were just saying. We listen to the just in order not to be unjust. Let's look at another type of subordinate clause in which we see the subjunctive. A clause of fearing is a subordinate clause in which the speaker expresses his or her fears about something. Naturally, we see words like phobos, phobia, we get our word from, which means fear in Greek, in such constructions. Curiously, we always see the word me in such constructions, and we can translate it simply as that. Such clauses are negated with u to avoid confusion with the me. Kind of gets complicated. Fears about what will or might not happen are expressed in the subjunctive. So these are fears about the future. So we're going to see words like phobos, and we're always going to see me, and we're going to see the subjunctive when the fear is about what will or might not happen. An example, phobos este me adekoi omen. So we have our word of fearing, phobos este, that might mean something like there is a fear, and the me can be translated as that, and adekoi omen, that we might be unjust. There is a danger or fear that we shall be unjust, that we might be unjust at some point in the future. So this is a clause of fearing. We see several signs that this is a clause of fearing, phobos and me, and then we see the subjunctive as well. Again, phobos este, there's a danger or fear. Me, another ingredient in a clause of fearing, and then the subjunctive. Occasionally, the verb or noun of fearing must be inferred from context. Sometimes it's left out, which makes it hard to recognize these sometimes. For instance, simply, me adekoi omen. This, even though we don't have something like phobos este or pabumai, I fear, we would still translate as I fear that, or maybe perhaps we shall be unjust. This is still the same kind of construction, even though we've left out some of the other important information. Indefinite clauses. An indefinite clause refers to all the things, places, etc. that are possible under a certain condition. In English, we often add the suffix ever to a pronoun like what or where to start an indefinite clause. You believe whatever he tells you. Wherever you go, there you are. Here, whatever and wherever start what we could call indefinite clauses. Whatever he tells you on its own, that subordinate clause would not have a complete meaning. Wherever you go, to would not have a complete meaning. They are subordinate clauses, indefinite clauses, to be precise. In Greek, indefinite clauses begin similarly. For instance, you might see a relative pronoun and this little particle un. And this means we can think of this un as basically changing the relative pronoun to end with something like ever. For instance, has un would be whoever. When has, we're talking about nominative masculine singular, so we're talking about a single individual. Another example would be ha-an, which would be whatever. These are both forms of the relative pronoun. The second one is the singular neuter nominative or accusative. We're talking about one thing and not one person, not many things. So we have to look at both the un to get the ever, but also the case and the number and gender and all that of the relative pronoun to interpret this correctly. We also see conjunctions with this little particle an. For instance, hinna an would be wherever. We saw that the conjunction hinna can mean not only so that or in order to, but can also on its own just mean where. And with un, we would take it to mean wherever. Hate plus an would be whenever. Hate means when. And these two sounds sometimes get combined, actually. Hate an, since we have a vowel at the end of the first word and at the beginning of the second, into one. Hatan would be whenever. And these indefinite clauses often, though not always, end with a verb in the subjunctive. So these would be indefinite clauses and how to translate them. They're not too difficult to translate, actually. Let's look at one example. Akuamen tauta halegusin hoitikaioi. So this on its own is not an indefinite clause. We don't have the un. We also don't have a verb in the subjunctive. This is a relative clause, not an indefinite clause. Literally, we listen to the things, or those things, that the just say. That they say would be the halegusin. We listen to what the just say. It's probably a more elegant translation. Now, we can take this relative clause and turn it into an indefinite clause by doing two things. First of all, adding the particle un, and then taking that verb in the indicative, legusin, and turning it into the subjunctive, legasin. So akuamen tauta ha an legasin hoitikaioi changes this from we listen to what the wise say to we listen to whatever the just say. The just. Now, let's take a look at conditionals with a subjunctive. Just as hatan, hate plus an equals whenever, ean, a plus an equals if ever. And this little particle here, this ean, is something we see all the time in conditional sentences. Again, if-then statements. We find this ean in the protasis, the if part, of a future open conditional, which has to do with possible eventualities. Really, this is almost like a default conditional statement. The apodosis of such a conditional sentence, the then part, can be in the future tense or the imperative. Here the example I give is in the imperative. Ean legosin hoidikaioi akue. So we can translate ean as if ever or even simply if. So if the just speak, ean legosin hoidikaioi akue. Listen. We're talking to one person, we're ordering that person to listen. If or if ever the just speak. More commonly, we actually see the future tense in the apodosis of a future open conditional like this. For instance, if ever the just speak, we shall listen, would be a very common kind of conditional sentence in Greek. And we would see, again, the ean plus subjunctive in the protasis and the future tense in the apodosis. If ever the just speak, listen. For the forms of the subjunctive of aime, I am, take a look at page 93. And for further reading, especially on future open conditionals, take a look at pages 184 to 185. Thank you very much.